Doing well. Today I have a very special guest. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, so my name is Erin Niimi Longhurst, and I'm a British Japanese author.
Erin is also being a little modest as she also is a director at a digital agency who helps people achieve their goals. She's also a trained private chef, and she's been featured in BBC, Vogue, Stylist, and many other um, article-based websites, along with MarthaStewart.com. She has been published and recognized in many other aspects. That being said, I plan on interviewing Erin on her book, A Little Book of Japanese Contentments, which I have right here. I have indeed purchased it and I have read it. And it's a great book because you can just pick it up and pretty much read it anytime and get a sense of fulfillment. And we're going to be going over that actually in the last part. But what I'm going to do is we're first going to go over just writing in general, then Japanese culture, and then the book, A Little Book of Japanese Contentments. All right, you ready,
Let's do
Erin?
it. Yeah, yeah.
All right, so my first question for you is what inspired you to start writing?
So my books came about because I essentially had a food and travel blog. So I was living in London. I had just graduated from university and I was kind of getting to know the city. So I was born in London, but my mother's Japanese and my father's English, but we moved around quite a bit. So I was based in New York for a while as well. So London, even though I was born here, was like a new city for me. So I essentially, yeah, started a blog, and mostly it was just to let friends and family know, what I was up to and what cool restaurants and things like that I had come across. And alongside that, it was a way for me to express my love and interest for cooking and other sort of practices that I'd grown up with, particularly from my mother's Japanese side. So yeah, it was just kind of like an outlet. And for the first couple of years, the only person that read it, I think, was my grandma. And that was great. Obviously, very small but highly engaged audience. But then it was through that and the kind of recipes I was sharing and different cultural sort of anecdotes that my publishers found me, and they were like, we're really interested in publishing a book around Japanese lifestyle and culture, and would you be interested? So yeah, I think how I kind of started was this little sort of blog, and was just randomly, I actually kind of wound it down after my books started publishing. I do still share some recipes on my website, but um, yeah, that's kind of how my journey came about.
That's incredible. This actually kind of goes into my next question. So, writing isn't something you always wanted. Writing isn't necessarily something you always wanted to do. It's something you just started within the blog, correct? Or
Yeah, I mean, I think I always loved writing and creative writing in particular, but I think, perhaps I wasn't initially like, this is something that I'm going to do as my career. This was like a fun hobby of mine. And so that's kind of how I was expressing myself. So, I've been working for a while now at a sort of social media agency, and I do a lot of copywriting for clients, but this was the one space where I could write whatever I wanted. And I didn't need to have anyone kind of copy editing or proofreading or anything like that. So yeah, it really came out of my, just love and enjoyment for it. And I think in many ways it was really nice because it didn't put too much pressure on me. But it was also really lovely that there was an audience out there that were really interested in, some of these aspects, which for me, I kind of grew up with and took for granted. And, it was just like, oh, things that my grandma or my grandpa did. And the fact that people found them interesting or engaging was a really lovely surprise.
oh, absolutely. I know from your book specifically. Um, One thing I love about your writing in particular is it's very charming in the fact that, like, I love when you wrote that when you would travel to Japan, you would go with your grandfather to the convenience store at like 3 in the morning for, I believe it's like red bean ice cream, or
Yeah,
and
yeah,
I thought that was just so like lovable and charming because That's such like a mood. Like that's like I you know, I've never had red bean ice cream, but I can imagine like traveling to Japan on a very
Yeah.
long flight, like I would want to do that too. And and I just loved that. And so
Yeah. Oh.
absolutely. Um so do you have any favorite authors that you enjoy reading about or
Yeah, I mean, my reading taste is very much like my music taste in that it's kind of eclectic and all over the place. But I think for those of people who are interested in, I guess, Japanese culture, I think one author that I really do think evokes certain moods is Haruki Murakami. I think the fiction, so like Norwegian Wood, for example, that's a really powerful and emotive book. So that's one of my favorite authors. And then in terms of, I think, the nonfiction or books that I reference to spark my own creativity, I've really found The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron really helpful. So I think, the questions you asked at the beginning were around how I got into writing, and a lot of the things that the techniques that she shares in it to untap your own creativity is, I think, really helpful. So those are kind of two very different recommendations. But in reality, in terms of what I've been reading during the pandemic, I have found a lot of fiction I think because a lot of what has happened this year has been really heavy and dark, I've actually kind of retreated or maybe regressed into sort of childhood. And I've discovered this series called Hollowpox, and it's like a young adult sort of fantasy series. And it's really, if you want kind of a lovely escapism type fiction, where it's really, the story is entertaining and the universe that's created is really lovely, but it isn't too heavy. That is what I've been reading. So not very highbrow, the last one, but really enjoyable.
That's understandable. I mean, you know, what's great about fiction is it takes you to a whole nother world. And I think with this pandemic going on, that's kind of what we need is to be in another world. So that absolutely makes sense. That's great. Um, so, so when you're writing specifically, what do you feel is your biggest challenge?
My biggest challenge is finding the time. I know some people, I think for me personally, I've not had sort of writer's block in the same way that I know some writers do. I'm always able to create something. It's just how good that stuff is. But I think the most important struggle for me, especially because I've been doing this alongside a job and alongside, things like getting a puppy and all that stuff, it's
Right.
just finding the time. So that's the biggest challenge, I think, for me, is just to make the time. But yeah, in the book I mentioned earlier by Julia Cameron, The Artist's Way, a really useful trick is to just say, I'm only going to do this for 20 minutes. And then when you start it, and even if you've like put an alarm clock on to have that 20 minutes, I always kind of end up, you know, so I have to like trick myself into making the time essentially.
Right. That's a good strategy. Um, so I think with that said, because that actually would answer my next question, which was about, you know, tips and advice. So that's you already answered that, which is fantastic. I think I'm going to move right into Japanese culture. Um, so now this is a very tough question, but what is your favorite Japanese dish?
Dish. Ooh.
And
That's
if you
a
can't,
good one.
sorry to interrupt. I was just going to say
Yeah, no.
if it's difficult to think of one, give me three.
Yeah. So I think my favorite dish, because obviously there are so many different types of food, and I am very greedy, so I love them all. However, I think the most exciting part about food or any meal is kind of eating communally and sharing, and food as a way to connect people. And so I think one of my favorite ways of eating is something called onabe or nabe, which is essentially just means kind of like a sort of a clay pot, and it's a very much like a winter food. And you'll have um, I think shabu shabu is what it's called as well, but you'll have, a big sort of pot of broth in the middle of the table, and you'll have things like, you know, spinach or vegetables or really thinly sliced either cuts of beef or pork. And you kind of dip it all in and you kind of cook it in the kind of boiling broth. And then each person will have their own set of dipping sauces. So it's a sesame sauce or a ponzu, which is like a citrusy soy sauce. And so, you make it communally, but everyone has their own plate. And it's just a really warming dish. Again, it's funny to be talking about this dish as my favorite when in the UK anyway. It's like really hot outside, but that's one of my favorites. I think it's just, particularly in the cold winter, it's lovely to kind of have your family round and do that. And one of my favorite parts about it also is at the end of a meal, you'll have this really flavorful broth, and you can use it. You can put in a sort of a curry stock cube and make curry for the next day, or there's so many you could put udon noodles in and have a very flavorful udon meal essentially ready for the next day as well. I have actually a recipe for it on my website, but that is, I think, one of my favorites just because of the communal sort of aspect to it.
And so normally that's partaken in the winter?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So no, that's interesting because I actually want to ask you something that is so beautifully done about your book is that you mention forest bathing, and I believe that is what is that called? Not ikebana, that's flower arranging, which we'll get to after. But I remember there's a section in your book like forest bathing, and I remember essentially you mentioned red-crowned cranes, and there's a picture of it in the winter. Have you ever seen one of those, or?
Yeah, I mean, really, when I was a lot younger, I think, I used to live in Japan as a child, and my mum is from there, and her whole family. So when I lived there when I was younger, I did. But yeah, as I get kind of older, I think it would turned out whenever I go to Japan, so I'd spend a few months in the summer and then a few months in the winter. But by the time I got there in the winter, they would have kind of been done. But yeah, no, it's I mean, what I love about Japan is, you have such beautiful sort of, the seasons are very distinct, and they're all, very hot summers, but cold winters. I don't know, something nice about the change in seasons anyway.
Right. And actually that goes into my next question. What is one place everyone should visit in Japan if they visit?
Yeah, so I think, my family are mostly living in Tokyo, so obviously that's the capital, and there's so much going on there in terms of, I mean, it's a huge place, so lots to see. Even, you could spend a week in Tokyo and still, not get to scratch the surface, I suppose. But my family also, so during the week, my grandfather in particular, who was like a businessman, would work in Tokyo, but at the weekends would go to Kamakura, which is where my mum and her sisters grew up. So it's a city just under an hour away. So it's next to the sea. It used to be, back in the Edo period, the old capital of Japan. So you have these really beautiful old temples, and there's like a really giant Buddha statue there. And it's just, I think when people go to Japan, I always tell them to go to Kamakura because it's just my favorite place. And apologies, that is my doorbell. I'll be right back.
That's okay. This is just from what I've seen. I've never been to Japan, sadly. That is something on my to-do list. You had mentioned history and the Edo period. I'm very interested in Japanese culture, and so one place I'd love to go is Osaka Castle. Oh,
so sorry. Obviously, the doorbell has now woken someone up. So, there's a guest. Shall I quickly introduce Millhouse?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, as a doorbell rang, we now have a guest star. This is Millhouse. His Japanese name is Ponzu. But yeah, he gets a bit when he's napping, he's fine to be left alone, but when he's awake and he's realized I am in the other room, he would rather like to be close to me. So this is,
That's all right. He could join the interview. That's fine.
sorry, Millhouse, sorry, interrupted your. Would you like to start again about Osaka Castle?
Sure, sure. So yeah, so you had mentioned the Edo period, and like the architecture, and absolutely, I'm very interested in Japanese history, and a very old conqueror named Hideyoshi Toyotomi. He created Osaka Castle, and there's festivals, and there's lots of venues and vendors there. And I would love to do that. And anybody watching and listening who wants tips on where to go, that Osaka Castle is definitely it's in the Kansai region of Honshu. By the way, heads up, anything I pronounce in Japanese will probably be pronounced wrong, so I apologize, but I'm trying.
But yeah, Osaka is very famous for food as well, particularly noodle dishes. So yeah, that's definitely a good tip.
That awesome. Yeah, no, food is important. And then we had talked about the winter, and actually, something you could do in the winter is so up towards the north. I'm looking in my notes for it. There's it's called like the snow monkey like onsen, and there are these like snow monkeys while it's snowing. It's beautiful. And these monkeys just like bathe in these hot springs, and it's just one of the most beautiful things. And it's so interesting because apparently they picked it up from watching people like go in onsens, which I thought was really incredible. And so they go in and they're just like, like they love it.
Yeah, I mean, monkeys are incredibly. So there's also in like the same snow monkeys in Japan also have figured out how to use vending machines. So there was one region in Japan, I forget where, but they used to have a really big. I mean, they probably still do, where like, if someone was buying something from a vending machine, this like group of monkeys would like essentially mug the person and like take their coins, and then would learn how to, because I knew that actually if you put coins in and you smack something, then a bottle of like juice, and they'd figured this out.
Wow.
And so they had to, I think, yeah, I mean, I don't know how they got around that, but yeah, they're incredibly intelligent.
Wow, that's incredible. So yeah, so if you go to Japan, don't get mugged by monkeys. Do the best you can.
Yeah, you've been warned.
So throughout your book, you have a lot of really inspiring and great Japanese proverbs. Do you have a favorite?
I think the one is probably the one that I find most useful is Nanakorobi Yaoki, which means fall down 7 times, get up 8. And I think that is just a really great, proverb around perseverance and just, keeping on, and also about, I guess, not giving up. So that's, I think, one of my go-tos.
That's what I actually had written down as well as my as my favorite. Believe it or not, yeah. So that obviously must be a good proverb because even I picked it as well. But yeah, I love that proverb just for the simple message of perseverance, right? It doesn't matter how many times that you stumble, as long as you keep getting back up. That's the you're successful.
Yeah, exactly.
So, do you have a favorite Japanese tradition?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one I have written most about, or that kind of references other traditions, might be sort of tea ceremony. So my aunt, and I have a whole chapter of this in the book, was essentially like a, I don't know, like master of tea. So she's dedicated like over 30 years to mastering this like tradition. And I think what I love about tea ceremonies, it is about, serving the actual tea itself, but there are, references the different seasons and the changing of the seasons, you often have like an ikebana flower arrangement when you're sort of in the presence of it. And I think the principles of tea. So, everyone who studies tea ceremony and is a practitioner, kind of live their lives, I guess, keeping in mind the values of, tranquility and respect and purity. And I think those are, it's just a really lovely way to approach something, or approach, yeah, something, an act as simple as sort of having tea. And I think often, and I'm guilty of this myself, obviously I grew up in New York partially, and it's very much like grab a coffee in the morning and you go into the and you don't take the time to be like, okay, this is, you have a hot drink and you're not like, let's check in with ourselves, and where we are. So I think that's what's really beautiful about tea ceremony. So I try and, you know, I guess, incorporate some of those values in my own life, even though it is easier on some days than it is in others.
That's great. Absolutely. Um, with that said, um, I think I'm going to move now. That's a great time to transition into your book, A Little Book of Japanese Contentments. So I think we're going to head right there. So you had mentioned ikebana, which is flower arranging. Now, I'm actually very interested in this. I know it doesn't seem like something. I guess it's not the most like masculine thing. It doesn't seem like But I'm actually very interested. My dad gardens a lot, and I was curious. Is there like a particular art to ikebana? Is there a particular assortment that you like?
Yeah, so ikebana, it's really interesting that you actually mentioned the point around like masculinity and flower arranging, because actually, many ikebana practitioners are men, and sometimes, there have been tales that like army generals will practice ikebana to kind of clear their mind and sort of help them problem solve better. So
Wow.
I think the difference between ikebana and sort of traditional, or like quote unquote Western flower arranging, is that you don't really go into it with like, these are the flowers I have in mind, this is what I want it to look like. The whole point, or a lot of the point, is around the process itself, and the letting the materials supposed to speak to you, and you have them in a specific order, and they're very geometric, I suppose, and minimal. But yeah, letting the process reveal the arrangement, rather than just going in with like a preconceived notion of what it is you're going to do. And so in that way, it's very mindful. So I think, yeah, that is, I think, the sort of key difference with ikebana in particular. um, but yeah, no, I think, yeah, so my second book, Omoyari, also came out in the US, I think earlier, like, yeah, last week. I mean, I'm losing track of time. But in it, I write about, I suppose, like samurai code or culture, I suppose, a bit. So yeah, I think there are a lot of values in that also kind of reflects and are similar to the values that kind of are lived by through ikebana as well.
And that's great. And I will be asking you for another interview when I get that book as well. but um, but until then, from your book, A Little Book of Japanese Contentments, which section did you enjoy writing the most?
The food section. So I know you mentioned that I kind of went to culinary school and I love food. So when I gave my manuscript to the editor, she had to like cut back that chapter quite significantly. It was 3 times longer than any other. But
Wow.
yeah, I think food is such a, I'm such a keen interest in it, and that was definitely my favorite chapter to write about. I think also, Japanese food culture, like not only kind of the food itself and the recipe, but the kind of culture around it is fairly unique. And it was, yeah, just lovely to write about. And so, yeah, being able to share recipes and things like that was, yeah, great.
So A Little Book of Japanese Contentments was the first book you wrote?
So, yes. So, with the first book, so Japanism is what it's called in Europe, and so the UK and the rest of Europe, and most of the other markets that have sort of translated it. But in the US, a different publisher got the rights to it, so they changed the title and the cover. So Japanism and A Little Book of Japanese Contentments are kind of, yeah, same book, different covers. And my second book is called Omoyari, and HarperCollins kind of retained the rights in the US as well. So, and that's about kind of compassion.
Wonderful. That's great. So, um, being as this was essentially your first book, is there anything that you wish you could change or add? Or I know from what you just told me you would add more about the food section, but but
um, you know what? I think obviously, I think with anyone who's written anything or produced anything, will say the same thing. Like sometimes you'll look back and you're like, oh, I wish I'd done this differently or whatever. I think actually I'm really sort of proud for what the book was around in that specific moment in time. And I think what's been really interesting is, particularly during the pandemic, a lot of the practices I talk about in the book were things that people could do when they had to isolate and were at home. And so I think, obviously being able to write just a whole chapter about food would have, 3 chapters about food would have been amazing. But I think I'm not sure if there's anything I'd change about the first book, really. I think, the second book was really interesting to write because it was written during a time where it looked like this pandemic was like, oh, it's like a weird blip, but it'll probably only be a couple of weeks. And
right.
obviously it's just completely changed the course of everyone's lives, really. So,
Right.
no, I don't know if that sounds rude, but I think it was a good reflection of where I was at that point in time. So yeah.
No, I think that's a great answer. I mean, I know as a reader, um, my answer would be I wish there was more to this book, but that's normal for a reader to want. Is always to want more. And so you've mentioned that you've written another book, Omayari, and I definitely plan on getting that because that
Yeah.
should hopefully satisfy my craving for more. Um, but that being said, I think I've covered just about every question. Oh, I do have one more. I always end off my interviews with a lighthearted question. So my question to you is, what is your funniest moment that you're willing to share that happened while in Japan?
So, okay, this is I think I've got a good one. So I speak Japanese fluently. So my mum actually pretended till I was about 13 that she didn't speak English. She speaks English with a British accent. So she lived here as a kid. So she only did that because she wanted me to learn Japanese, and I'm very grateful for that now. But so a few years ago, I was at university and had gone back to Japan, and a few of my university friends from the UK had come with me. And I was meeting them in the center of town, and one of my friends was not so sure how to get there from their hotel. So my Japanese cousin met him at the hotel and was going to, have him join us. And at one point, my friend tried to go into a pachinko bar. So it's kind of like one of those like game, like kind of pinball gambling like shops, I suppose. And my friend was like, "Oh, what is this?" and kind of wanted to go in. And my cousin just wanted to say like, "Oh, you shouldn't really go in there. Can be a bit sketchy." But my cousin's English is not great. And the way he learned English was by watching Star Wars. And so when he was trying to get my friend to not go into a bad place, what he meant to say was like, don't go in there. It's like a bit dodgy. But what actually he was saying was like, don't, no, dark side of the force. And so what is going on? It's like, I wanted to go to this bar, but your cousin kept on saying it was the dark side of the force. And I was like, oh yeah, like just, I think it just means like, so that's probably my favorite. And also, it's just really funny that my cousin's English is, yeah, purely learned from Star Wars, so probably not that useful in like day to day, but the point gets across. So yeah, I think that was just like one of my favorite stories about my friends coming to visit me.
That that is a really great story. Um, so yeah, so with all of that said, I think that that concludes all my questions. Erin, I want to say thank you so much for joining me today. If you guys enjoyed this video, it doesn't even compare in comparison to actually reading this book. I'm going to put all the links in the description, and as well as where you can purchase this from Erin's website. The greatest thing about this book is that you can quite literally pick it up, read like a page, and get a sense of fulfillment right just from reading one page. It's a really great book. I highly recommend it. And yeah, and that concludes this interview. Thank you so much again, Erin.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was really kind, and yeah, no, it was lovely for those thoughtful questions, and obviously Millhouse was good to say hello as well.
Thank you, Millhouse.